Traveller's Guide to the Forgotten Realms, Episode 4, Gnomengarde. My dear Lord Sandrier, after my optimistic and enjoyable visits to Phandalin and Axholme, it seems that my run of good fortune has turned, and I find myself back in the Stonehill Inn. Please let me explain. It all started when we arrived at Gnomengarde. The road wound east-northeast just a few miles, descending lower and back into the tree line, where we came upon a roaring waterfall falling 60 feet or so into a pool that it had carved over eons. Finglepaw, our gnome guide, the one of his companions who had stayed with us so that the rest of his crew could return home with haste, pointed out a track for us to follow so that we might enter the town. He indicated how the walls of the cliff below were pockmarked with caves on either side, the span of the waterfall crossed by a stout, well-made-looking bridge. Gnomengarde, or what is left of it, is inside those cliffs, he said. Unfortunately, our king, the afflicted one, Corbaz, ordered the main entrance bridge demolished some time ago, before we came to understand his madness, so the cart may not be able to go inside, I'm afraid. Finglepaw had steadily become more anxious as we made our journey. He was a lithe, athletic young rock gnome, a little taller than average and a shade over 3.5 feet, with a neatly trimmed goatee the same grey as the rest of his hair, still streaked with bits of purple and royal blue that marked him out as a youngster, putting him at maybe 42 years. He paused as Grisander ushered her mule down the slope and took me to one side, looking embarrassed. "I know, friend Falrien, that you are compiling your chronicle of these parts," he said, "but please do try to bear in mind that Gnomengarde has fallen far from her old glories. We've only the tiniest number of our kind left here now, and we may not be able to remain for much longer. Many have departed since Corbaz lost his senses, and many more have disappeared without a trace." He went on to explain, as we walked down the slopes, that Gnomengarde had been founded millennia ago by his ancestors, and had been a member of the Phandelver Pact. Like all members, they had prospered then, like Axholme and Old Phandalin. But then had come the Orcs, and it had changed. Gnomengarde had fallen, and had staggered along through the long centuries ever since, surviving thanks to the abundant food and what he referred to as the magic. Now there were less than 24 gnomes that called Gnomengarde home. They spent their time crafting trinkets and minor magical items which they traded with nearby settlements, but they were becoming increasingly isolated due to their king and recent reports of Orcs in the region. We rounded the cliffs at the level of the river, which was small and quite slow, just 10 feet wide. Inside the canyon, permanently shielded from the sun by its position on the mountain, the waterfall had cut a wide pool from which protruded a pair of small islands, forested with enormous mushrooms, red on one, purple the other. As I stepped closer, I winced as a sharp stab of pain struck through my temple. "Do be careful, friend Falrien," Finglepaw said. "The magic here is strong, especially to those who are sensitive." I'm not sure what he meant by this, because I, as far as I am aware, have no magic. He indicated the mushrooms again, claiming that their tremendous growth was due to the magic. It was created here by our ancestors long ago. It makes it easier for our makers to craft magic items. It's the reason we remain here. The mushrooms are really good eating and turn into wine too. If we had to move, we'd need to farm and all that kind of thing. Then he led Griselda's mule through a shallow ford in the river so that we could approach the most accessible entrance to the town. A number of other rock gnomes emerged as we came closer, raising crossbows. They shouted at us to stop, and one of the gnomes scrabbled down to our level, hustling over. Finglepaw introduced him as Dimble, one of the main cooks. Middle-aged and paunchy, with the permanently red cheeks of someone who drinks too much, he rested with hands on knees for a moment. "My apologies, but the king has decreed that no guests are allowed inside the walls until the monster has been destroyed," he declared, looking clearly embarrassed. Apparently, several gnomes had gone missing since Finglepaw and his crew had left to trade, driving the king further into his madness. He knelt to Grisander, apologising for her wasted journey, as the king had locked him and his husband Nurkel in their bedchambers, refusing to come out. "He's ordering the place fortified, traps to be placed everywhere. People are terrified," he said. Grisander frowned and nodded, explaining that she was prepared to receive the king's wrath if she were to be allowed inside, but Dimble would hear nothing of it. Finglepaw looked horrified at the whole mess, turning a bright scarlet. Dimble looked me over, then turned to Finglepaw. "Perhaps the king might forgive us admitting one of our neighbours, especially one so exalted, but a foreigner? Never." They devolved into a back-and-forth argument in Gnomish, a tongue of which I have almost no knowledge of, which seemed to go on endlessly. Eventually, I simply offered to be on my way and return to Phandalin, as it was just a few miles north. Finglepaw was aghast at such a suggestion. "No, friend Falrien," he said. "At the very least we will feed you and give you wine before you are on your way. We would be shamed if you were to go from us with an empty belly." Dimble protested and grumbled, something about trouble, and then nodded and called for several other gnomes who came to help Grisander's mule and cart. I was led up the easiest slope and in through a low doorway by Finglepaw, wincing as the pain continued to shoot through my temple. Closer up, it was clear that the gnomes had indeed fallen far. All around were signs of long-lost greatness. All over the cliff walls were remains of contraptions, gangways and bridges, and I believe I saw the rusted remains of a metal crest protruding from the water near the falls, its form now lost to decay. Inside, the difference was even more apparent. After the 30-foot rough climb, I was led through halls carved dwarf scale through the mountainside, at least 7 feet high and so smooth I could barely feel them beneath my fingers. The oldest doors were also carved from stone and so beautifully made, fitting so well in the doors that one could not have fit a sheet of paper between them. But that was the old. Everything that was new had a shabby, cobbled-together appearance. Most of the glows had died out long ago, replaced with torches which fouled the air with smoke, and the walls with scorch marks. The doors were almost haphazard, roughly cut and mounted on rusty hinges which squealed as they were opened. Inside, the booming sound of the waterfall echoed through every chamber, causing one to need to almost shout to be heard. At one point, Fingalpaul noticed my observations and smiled sadly. As I said, friend Falrien, we are not what we once were. Things have not been good for us here for a long time. I was led north into a dining room which had the same contrast as the corridors. The room itself was clean and orderly, with well-made cupboards and a wooden cabinet, but the gnome-scale table and chairs were rough, sorry-looking things. Fingalpaul offered Grisander and I a seat, as another gnome, apparently called Turvaround, brought in 2 bottles of strange purplish liquid and 3 steaming loaves of green bread. Fingalpaul asked Turvaround about another gnome called Thistlewand and someone else called Brightweasel, but she just shook her head sadly. We spent an awkward few minutes as Fingalpaul explained that the magical mushrooms supplied all the residents of Gnomengarde needed food and drink. That the purple ones could be fermented into wine, and the green ground into powder to form the basis for the bread. The bread was delicious, sweet and hearty, but somewhat spoiled by a strange oiliness, and the texture giving the impression that one was eating meat. The wine, however, should it actually be called such, was awful. Gag-worthy. The first sip I took I struggled to keep down, but quickly discovered the reason that the gnomes like it. After just one sip I found my mood raised, and my anxieties boiling away like a morning mist. Both went some way to explain how these charming people were able to stomach their lives in such a depressing place. After a few minutes of awkward shouted conversation, another gnome came in, whispered in Fingalpaul's ear, and hurried out again. My companion sighed and stood, then, apologising to me. Apparently another gnome had vanished, and the king was issuing an embarrassing order. He offered to escort me back to Phandalin, while he hoped Grisander might be able to help the king. I accepted the offer and made my exit. We emerged soon after, and my ears rang from the roar of the waterfall for at least an hour as I walked to Phandalin beside Fingalpaul, who rode a large, shaggy riding dog that looked much like a wolfhound. I write this second part of the letter from the Stone Hill Inn several hours after returning, glad for a bed and decent beer. Toblin welcomed me as I stepped inside, footsore and clutching a 3/4 empty bottle of the disgusting but strangely pleasant wine. I will write more tomorrow, but I've just been introduced to a trio of brothers, shield dwarves, who are looking for some long-lost dwarf hold that has been destroyed by the orcs. They're talking about some kind of magical nexus that was once harnessed into a forge that was used to create magic weapons and armour. They call it Wave Echo Cave, and suggested that if it's found, it could earn them a fortune. I may well head out with them when they leave tomorrow, if they'll have me. For now, I still have this headache. I remain your humble servant, Falrien. There is always another dawn. Writer's note. This is very much my own take on Gnomengarde. The way it's presented in the Dragon of Ice Spire Peak book makes very little sense to me. The writers seem to have been torn in terms of what it was actually meant to be. Is it a town, settlement, a ruin, some kind of obstacle course filled with weird traps, or is it supposed to be a dungeon? None of these are clearly what the writers intended. I appreciate that this is probably because they wanted it to fulfill several roles in order to introduce characters to different concepts, but I think it hugely wastes a great opportunity to tie together another location into the downfall of Wave Echo Cave and Old Phandalin as part of some bigger narrative. It gives stakes. If these gnomes are just dwindling away to the point that a mimic is causing an existential threat, then they really do need help. I see the whole region as being so shocked hard by the destruction of Old Phandalin and Wave Echo Cave that it has never recovered. Should Phandalin be given a chance, Wave Echo Cave re-established, Axholm opened back up and Gnomengarde reinvigorated, the Sword Mountains could emerge as a true regional powerhouse, and that's a game I really want to play in. If you like this video, please like and comment so that I know whether people are appreciating this kind of content, and subscribe and ring the bell to remain notified of new releases, which are coming more frequently, as you can see. Please have a look at fiverr.com/characterlore if you'd like a custom-made NPC, organisation or town, or even campaign creating. But if not, rest assured I value each and every one of you viewing my videos. All hail Chauntea the Great Mother. This is Thomas, of the Lore Lounge.